Okay, it looks like I'm recording. So today is April 24th, but this is going to be posted as my May 1st, 2021 MSc-ECO course number 620. And we have a special guest that I had hinted at last month because we had just had like an email or two. And it's a guy that's kind of more or less related to what I'm talking about, because when I was in my master's degree, I was doing research in ecocentrism, and the NEP came up. So this guy here is the originator, and he's going to define what it is, and he's going to talk about his journey. And I have permission to call you Riley, and I am Martin. So
Yes.
go ahead. Who are you, Riley? How do you relate to this topic?
Well, I'm an aging environmental sociologist.
Okay.
Um, Recently retired, but been a professor of sociology since 1972, and happened to get in on the ground floor, helping found something called environmental sociology. But in terms of worldviews and stuff, let me back up a little bit because my own experience was one of a profound shift in worldview.
Mhm.
So I ended up, I think we moved there in the fourth grade, being raised way up on the top of the Northern California coast in a small town that depended on timber and commercial fishing. Lots of salmon, lots of redwoods, but all kinds of other trees. And I was just part of that culture. Blue collar family, stepdad worked in often in lumber plants, stuff like that. 1 year as a commercial fishing. And in that culture, I mean, salmon were everywhere. I could go to the Smith River when the salmon came in and chase them up the stream and so forth. We had 2 acres of land with second growth redwood. This is kind of embarrassing, but I remember when I got old enough, we had one little chainsaw and one big one. And on a lark, I went out way in the back, and there was a little redwood tree about 12 inches in diameter. Uh, yeah, and feel guilty now, but I proudly cut it down. I knew how to watch the guys, and we. You don't want single redwood trees too close to a house. They blow over a lot. So I went off to college, San Francisco State, is where I graduated. Be, Became interested in sociology. You get some course something, but I decided I really liked it, and I just fell in love with academia. I mean, I loved college campuses, and I began to fantasize about this life as a professor. Oh my God, you could spend your time in the library, you could sit out on the lawn, leaning against a tree, reading a book, blah 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 blah. So I decided to go to grad school, which was very weird. I was the first person in my family to go to college, and then to go to grad school. Like, why do you want to do that? But I did, and I ended up at the University of Oregon,
Mhm.
uh, Eugene, and I consider myself a political sociologist. I was always interested in politics. Why are some people liberals, some conservatives? And actually, I had been raised by a very almost a John Bircher stepfather. I realized later, and Vietnam War really had a big effect on me. I changed dramatically. But at Oregon, so I was going to study. Well, I ended up doing for my master's thesis, a study of student political actors. Remember the SDSers, the radical left Students for a Democratic Society, and I compared them to the Young Americans for Freedom. So I kind of had these two competing political views, and I did my little study. And about the time I was done, preparations for Earth Day started. And as you might imagine, Eugene, Oregon, and that, it was a big deal. And one day I woke up and I thought, who are these eco activists? Are they like the SD, old leftists with the new cause, or like the right wing was, trying to portray them, or are they real centrist. A lot of the left people were saying, you're distracting, this Earth Day stuff is distracting us from civil rights, anti-war, et cetera. So we did this little study. Unfortunately, often happens in academia, there was a young assistant professor there who was very interested in conservation. Came a long tradition of, he'd spend summers on Forest Service fire lookouts and stuff like that. I mean, he was a Sierra Club type, but he was interested in these things. So together we did a little study of these student eco-activists. And he actually knew the student eco-activists, and I was in charge of doing a little random sample of undergrads to compare them. And so we did our study, and on the first Earth Day, which just surprised the 51st happened just the other day, and did that. And anyway, I wasn't sure what I was going to do, but you kind of get into an area. Then I ended up doing a dissertation comparing support for environmental legislation between Democratic and Republican members of the Oregon legislature. Found Democrats significantly more likely. Ended up another very fortuitous thing. I was hired at Washington State University. Land grant very, very early on. I wasn't, the idea of moving to the wheat fields. Yeah.
Okay, so you were hired after your master's degree that you completed?
No, I was finishing my PhD actually, and those were the easy old days.
Combined.
Yeah, I was supposed to have my PhD done when I got there, but neither I nor my two other cohort members were quite done. Okay. And it was the easy days to get jobs. I got hired in November for the following fall. Wow. And before I got to Washington State to join the sociology department, I was offered a part-time research appointment in rural sociology, which was part of the College of Agriculture. Usually they're two separate things entirely, but at Washington State University, they made rural sociology just a research and extension, no teaching in rural. And what they would do is take sociology faculty with relevant interest, and they would hire us. So it became clear they wanted me in rural sociology because they realized that environmental issues were going to become more important. Sociology, blah. And so that just kind of put me on the path I gave up, well, I didn't give it up, but political sociology became sort of a second thing, and I started focusing on environment. But there was no such thing as environmental sociology.
Okay, so I'll just come back. Most people from the United States know that when you say college, for us, it's like university here in Canada. And you were talking about the redwoods, and we have old growth trees here that there's still people petitioning to save here. So it's still the same thing. And when you were talking about your interest in these two younger activist groups, it's interesting that even before you did your research to see what they had to say, what they believe, what they were fighting for, that you were trying to already come up with their answers, or other people were trying to give you this manufacturing a consent of what they represented, what they believe. Oh, they're like this. So it's great that at the beginning you were developing the critical thinking skills to go find out what it's really about, because not just in that time, Riley, but even today, when something seems slightly different, right away, there are almost unconscious, some are conscious, but some are unconscious collectives that try to guide public opinion or shorten assumptions to try to find out, what they believe, what they do, what their interests, their values are. So it was nice that at the beginning of your career, you kind of realized in comparing these groups that there could be big differences and similarities, if I'm assuming correctly. Now, bringing you back to where you were, because that was the subject of your master's, comparing these two young.
And that was political. I'm sorry, and that was political activists. I needed you need to publish to get a good job in graduate school. Not so badly then. Nowadays, it's almost totally a requirement, but I wanted to. And so before I started a dissertation, I saw the study of Earth Day activists. It's just oh, this will be some articles to publish. Then I'll get into a dissertation. Okay.
And this was at still the graduate level, which sometimes we say master.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So I was in, it would have been my third year of grad school.
And then, if you can still hear me, because it's freezing a little bit, is then suddenly you were at the forefront of what.
And then, like I said, comparing Republican and Democratic legislators. Now, to pick up on something you just said, yeah, what we found, there.
It's freezing a little bit, the internet here.
Uh-oh.
Okay. And there's not a lot of
something.
comments. Yeah. So I think it's okay now. And just to bring you back,
Okay.
is you were talking about Earth Day as, guiding away from the political activism to Earth Day, and also at the forefront of what became environmental sociology. This is where we were.
Okay. Well, in a nutshell, but I want to just, on that little study, in terms of what you were saying about people portraying, what we found was middle ground. The right-wing portrayal of them as, radical leftists with a new cause was definitely not correct. And the left-wing view of them as, just standard people, they were kind of in between. They were definitely more liberal, more likely to be Democrats, et cetera, than a sample of students, a random sample, but they weren't as leftist as the SDS students. So I could compare them to those. So yeah, I wasn't really, I was thinking of political ideology, to be honest. But so I get the job at Washington State. But all this time now I'm getting more interested. So I'm starting to, Paul Ehrlich, Rachel Carson, that's very commoner, these people I'm reading. And then again, things happen in academia. My second year there, in the middle of it, the sociology department hired this more senior sociologist named William Catton. And he was a real avid outdoor guy. He was at the University of Washington for years, and he and his family would hike around Mount Rainier. And he got fed up. Seattle was growing so much, and he moved to New Zealand for a while, but discovered it was just too far away, came back to America, and lo and behold, we hired him. And he's the guy, he was very interested in looking at human societies from a truly ecological prism. Carrying capacity, these things, he was into that much more than me. But we began to talk and share ideas, and we realized, we had things in common. And about that time, the American Sociological Association set up a task force. They labeled it environmental sociology, but it was to develop guidelines for social impact assessment. Remember, in the 70s, some legal things happened that required social impact assessments for environmental impact statements. And he was on there, because he had a pretty big name, served on that committee. He had status in the department. And I had already formed a little group. There's a smaller thing called the Society for the Study of Social Problems. And it's much smaller than the American Sociological Review. And they have little divisions. And I was just kind of gung ho. I've always been someone that, let's build things, let's create something here. And so I went to another senior person when I first got to Washington State and saying, do you think we call it triple SP would like an environmental problems division? He said, I don't know, write to my friend, so-and-so is the president. And I did, and took them a while, but they came back and said, yeah, sounds a good idea. If you can we appoint you temporary chair. If you can get 50 people, you'll have a division. So we launched that thing in 93. But ASA is a much bigger organization. In those days, about 15,000. And this committee that Catton was on gradually expanded its interests, and the guy leading it wanted to set up an American Sociological Association section on environmental sociology. And that finally, it became official in 76. And my colleague, Bill Catton, was elected to the first chair, and I was elected to the council. So here we have an ASA section and the term environmental sociology. And to be honest, I'm going like, man, I don't know what environmental sociology is yet, but I really like it. I want to be one. So my mission set out like Bill Catton, somebody's got to define this field. Someone's got to say what environmental sociology is. How about us? And that led, as things happened, to some presentations, but our very first article, 1978 article called Environmental Sociology, a New Paradigm. And we laid out a tentative version of what we call the new environmental paradigm and a human exemptionalist paradigm, which we then modified shortly to a new ecological paradigm versus a human exemptionalist paradigm. So that's going on, but simultaneously, academic scholarly work, lots of things going on. I'm in rural sociology. They're doing pioneering work at Washington State on survey research. And I'm encouraged to do environmental surveys. And I came across a term in my very first course. I got to teach a little grad course called Environment and Society, my third year, 74. And, I couldn't call it environmental sociology. But anyway, it was by a political scientist, Dennis Parages and Paul Ehrlich, called ARC2. But in there, they borrowed from some folks at a Stanford Research Institute the term dominant social paradigm. And it was kind of like this constellation of beliefs. How does the typical American see things? Well, we take for granted, on the one hand, things like capitalism is, private property rights, the economy is important, but also faith in science and technology to solve problems. The notion that resources are essentially limitless. The future is, we're making great progress. The future is going to be much better than the past. And this very optimistic worldview. And I said, I want to measure that. And we started out and I was trying to come up with all these dimensions. But here's the point that I've been building to. I'm reading that literature and trying to design that survey in 75. But I'm also reading Commoner and this. And my aha moment, if you will say, I said, environmentalists, at least the kind of the more intellectual ones, they're not just talking about new policies for environmental protection or strengthening laws. They're talking about the idea that there are actual limits, the limits to growth that affected me. They're talking about that. They're talking about humans are, in that simplistic sense, upsetting the balance of nature. And they're beginning to criticize the idea that humans are not the only important species. And I said, my gosh, there's kind of an alternate to the dominant Western worldview emerging. It's, I don't know, let's call it the new environmental paradigm. And now, so I actually developed the NEP scale first before Catton and I did my work. But that's that's how things blend. And to be honest,
Oh, go ahead. To be honest,
Catton was, this comes back to things, he had been sort of hinting at the outmoded sociology paradigm, and he didn't didn't use the word human exemptionalism or anything like that, but he was saying, sociology is getting outmoded for all these new problems. So it was a case of cross fertilization, and in a very mundane sense, as a young assistant professor, I don't know if I would have been brave enough to criticize sociology as all resting
Yeah,
on
but
this human exemptionalism paradigm.
you wouldn't have been brave enough in the classroom, in an article with your peers at the university. What do you mean?
Now, I wouldn't, yeah, to publish this critique of, basically all of sociology rests on these outmoded assumptions that make it impossible to understand what's happening in the world. But I don't know. But
I want to say something about that.
Catton,
Go ahead and finish up.
yeah, Catton was, more senior, more established. And in my department, we were getting, I had a department head in sociology, unlike rural sociology, warned me about all my environmental work and saying, people who hitch their career to a bandwagon may fall off. He just thought environment was going to be this little quick issue, but I could sense, no, I learned enough that I said, these problems are not going away. We're stuck. We got to change things. But so all those things build in. But anyway, Catton and I tried to change things in sociology.
It's interesting because the conversations you're talking about when you're faced with what I call the grand realizations, where you kind of have this tipping point to change your own worldview and paradigms, is you can tell that ego always is a wall to push through. And egocentrism is kind of the opposite extreme, I would say, of ecocentrism. So like you didn't want to challenge, the basic assumptions of sociology, but even today, this kind of lack of scientific approach or objectivity is in every field. So every field, if suddenly through a miracle the next day the scientists working in these fields would be able to objectively accept the evidence that is quite apparent, then of course we would jump many steps forward, but we are not because of our lack of human thinking tools, right? And a lot of it is the elitism, the status, and the ego of contemplating career when it's not about us. It's about the biosphere, right? For our own survival, it has to be about the biosphere.
I mean, if you're an untenured assistant, the big issue on your mind, I want to be a professor, say, I got to get tenure. I don't want to overplay this. I mean, I'm just trying to, collaborations are unique and the people bring in within the department, as I really push for, let's set up more courses, let's hire people. But an untenured assistant, people look at you and say, well, we don't even know if you're going to be around. You want us to build on your interests. But so when you have a senior partner, it gives you more credibility and so forth. But I was gung-ho about, once I realized what we had. Now, don't get me wrong. This is going to be good. I never dreamed. I got to just tell you a little story of the rewards. That article has been reprinted in at least 7 big volumes, like a new one coming out on research on socio-ecological issues or something, a big handbook. And I'm really excited. We just got permission to reprint it in a Brazilian journal's translation into Portuguese. So it's kind of, I knew we were onto something big, but looking back now, after 43 years, it's had more effect than I expected.
And you're talking about the 1978 original article.
Yeah.
Now, for me, if I was in your shoes, here's the kind of guy I am. If they would reprint and I write a preface, is that the right pronunciation? Preface for it? Yeah. I would say, what is it about our species And it's barriers, self-imposed barriers, that makes it that we've barely moved forward from this from 1978, right? Especially if it's been cited so many times. And it's great that in your lifetime you see this. But the things I'm working on, luckily my ego is in check pretty much, is I know, because otherwise I wouldn't work on them, is I know that what I'm working on, there may or may not be a future after I'm dead where what I worked on productively made a difference. So you got to be out of your ego and not be pursuing status or elite or career or a monetary paradigm for this stuff. But I'm proud that you actually didn't give up on it and you're a fighter. And I understand also that even within this system that has a lot of ego, although you are also working on eco, is that you understood that you had to form collaborations. Otherwise, maybe this 1978 article wouldn't even have come out, right?
Yeah.
So these collaborations were important, and it had to be a little bit playing the academia game. But I'm glad that in your older age, hopefully you don't care so much about that, although the rewards still feel good. But you realize that this is a potential human condition change of course. And it's sad. We should ask why they're so slow, these things, right? Because we'll never catch up to modernity. And it's my theory on human domestication syndromes that explains we are doomed. We're so far from modernity and the natural world that we will never catch up. We'd have problems to solve. We need extraterrestrials to help us because we can't do it ourselves anymore. But still, you are one of the culture repairers, I would say, of sociology as a whole, because you mentioned the social sciences. And what I work on is a grand unification theory of all the social sciences, and I'll tell you about it later. And I need to be working on something that is so big that even if it fails in my lifetime, at least it wasn't steps forward when during my lifetime more steps backwards were happening. And that's my gamble a little bit, to try to have value in my life as a human being. Go ahead, Riley.
Yeah, well, most of us like that. I mean, it's gratifying. Well, anyway, things developed. Environmental sociology got going pretty well. The Reagan years took sort of a toll on us, like he pushed environment off the agenda. A lot of work in, I don't want to dwell too much on the field, but a lot of the early work, including mine, was studying public attitudes, opinions, studying the environmental movement and all that. But it was when the energy crisis came along and more and more awareness, things like toxic waste. That, we defined environmental sociology as a study of interactions between society and the environment. And then we said there is a sociology of environmental issues, which simply involves taking traditional sociological perspectives from public opinion, social attitude theory, social movement theory, environmental, and applying it, using the environment, some environmental issue is a topic. Well, over time, those have meshed, and we just consider environmental sociology to be what those of us in the field do. But that was an important distinction to me. And that was the whole limits to growth. And then it was like that 73, 74 energy crisis. It was just like a stamp of reality. It says, see, all this limits talk. Now we know that all kinds of political factors, having to do with the tensions in the East and Far East, Middle East set this up. But nonetheless, I sat actually with my wife and little daughter in a 4-hour line in a Portland service station, trying to get back from visiting my family. Though this little town was Crescent City, and Pullman, Washington. I mean, I was raised in an age when I got my first car, I went into the service station, gas was 24.9 a gallon. For $1, I could put in 4 gallons of gas and survive for a week or two, So when something that you have just taken for reality disappears, So that really reinforced my view and all that. And it was a battle just within our department, but fortunately, we hired two more guys, one to teach social impact assessment, one energy and society. And Washington State literally had the first graduate program in environmental sociology in the world. And I was quite proud of that. And a lot of things led to me becoming disenchanted. But the field has its up and downs. Um,
Riley, I'll ask a couple of questions because I want to be sure people understand the difference between anthropocentric type thinking and ecocentric type thinking. And I think you are a good candidate to have these kinds of conversations included here. So for example, was there a time in your career, and I don't know what you're working on right now, and I haven't studied you as if I'm your groupie or anything, so I don't know what you've done to grow from this original 1978 shift of paradigm, but when did, if ever, you and your peers, as your field was becoming multidisciplinary, start incorporating other species, let's say, or habitats, more of a global kind of worldview in the thinking, so that it's not just about, running out of oil or where to put our waste or things like that, and the conflicts politically that came out of it. So tell me about that kind of shift. When?
Yeah. Well, I can't think of a shift. Let's put it. I did learn Catton was very technologically pessimistic. And what you were saying, and I was extremely pessimistic. Over time, I've seen developments, things that I'm definitely not an optimist. I'm very worried about the future with climate change. But I learned to maybe not let every new problem freak me out and go, but limits to growth did not go over so well. As you know, there were a lot of critiques and so forth. But I shifted to the term ecological constraints. So this idea, we went from an idea where humans were just exempt from nature. We were totally unlike all other species. We could do whatever we want. We were free of ecological constraints. Our view, and most environmental sociologists, basically, well, humans are embedded in an ecosystem, right? And we're dependent. When we put waste in, we take resources out, we screw up the living space. We can create real problems. We cause the problems, but they're problems because they come back to bite us and, of course, other species. So I think this was a slow evolving field. Some people in environmental sociology take it very seriously. But here's the thing, you might not have, most people wouldn't think of. The problem is, I like to say Catton and I took a multi-species view. Humans were but one of many species, but of course, a particularly important one in all kinds of ways.
Well, for us.
Yeah.
But not necessarily for the biosphere.
Yeah, no, but important in the sense that we were having far and away the biggest impact and so forth. So I mean it that way, not like, oh, we're so important. But it's almost lost my train of thought here. We gradually came to, oh, I know where I was. So we tried to embed human societies in the ecosystem. Now here's the problem. And Catton he wrote a very famous book called Overshoot that built on our ideas, but in 1980. And it had a mixed reception. It got much better attention outside of sociology than within, because it was this, basically, he's looking now at Homo sapiens as a species and its relationship to all the other species, the rest of the ecosystem. But sociology, our fundamental categories, our strength, is to focus on the human species and look at gender differences, traditionally class differences, gender, racial differences. These are the analytical terms that make sociology what it is, inequalities and social organization. And so I realized there was a limit. If you focus only on the multi-species model, you lose your sociological tools. And we see this right now, a really hot issue in society, but is environmental justice. We can't understand inequalities without bringing in environmental hazards and so forth. They become a really critical contributor to inequality. And we know non-whites and low status groups are continually exposed for various reasons. So there's a lot of sociologists don't see themselves really as ecological. Maybe they're really nowadays considered, well, focus on environmental justice issues and women's issues and these things with environment. So
I think with this multidisciplinary approach, which should be in every field, and it should be something that if somebody wants to argue or shy away from it, we call it, hey, that's intellectual laziness. For example, me, if I went to a meeting of environmental sociologists and I came up to a microphone to ask a question to one of the speakers, one of them could be, and I just thought of this, is if somebody wants to call themselves an environmental sociologist, and let's say we had already defined environmental as, the interconnected ecology that is global at some, at this point, most of us understand, with climate change, the interconnectedness, that it doesn't stop at a barrier of a country. So would somebody calling themselves an environmental sociologist be better at what they do if their, let's say, bachelor's degree was more in, let's say, zoology or biology or ecology than in, let's say, psychology or sociology? And my answer would be yes. If somebody has that title, their background would have to be more of the hard sciences than the social sciences, if that's the term to use. And in part, it'd be because I think it's easier to learn the sociology part than it is, and it's easier to add second that knowledge instead of first. And also, if you do first and you go academia, right, you're learning a lot of outdated paradigms in sociology in your studies, which makes it almost impossible to program your brain with the environmental part, where we're not the center of the universe, kind of thing. What do you think about that?
well, in fact, some of my students, a few of the grad students I worked with, had bachelor's degrees in environmental studies, or maybe they got sometimes a bachelor's degree in a social science, a master's degree in environmental studies, which usually have kind of a social science versus physical science emphasis, but clearly they got to learn ecology and so forth. So I think it's a good background. And one of the early figures who had a big impact, Alan Schneeberg, turned out he had a bachelor's degree in chemical engineering, but that gave him a really good knowledge of
I think engineering is a great platform as a foundation coming before other things that we've been talking about, by the way. And learning the scientific part that is at the root, either the micro or the macro understanding of the natural world, I think that should come earlier instead of later. There would be an advantage to that. Not everybody needs that, but there'd be a definite advantage to that, I believe. Now, when you said somebody doing environmental studies, for me, I can't take that term seriously and make assumptions unless I go see what the curriculum is, because it might be entirely anthropocentric. And therefore, we have to define those terms, right? And they'd be so different.
I think, like I said, programs actually, there's a tendency for the ones that really focus on the natural sciences to be labeled environmental science programs, and the environmental studies programs will be more social science, policy, inevitably some environmental economics, hopefully ecological economics too. There's a big difference. Um, yeah, but you know, people get to where they are in different ways. I've a self-taught and frankly still a somewhat of a dilettante of a an ecologist. You know, I started subscribing to Science Magazine long ago. Just uh, read very few of the truly scientific articles, but they have great, uh, you know, summaries of new developments and in things by science writers actually that help you understand things. Like I know we get to this later, but my big deal now is climate change and climate change denial. And I got to know a number of climate scientists. I certainly can't fully understand the more technical pieces to a point where I could in any way make a critical evaluation, but I know enough about them and their credibility and their reputations. I got a pretty good sense of,
Yeah, and
you
it's
know, the
not about,
foundations of
explaining
science.
the chemistry behind it, for example, to a class. It's more about the
Yeah.
interconnectedness. So, for example, when I look at the books behind you, Riley, if you were going to say there's five dominant subjects or themes of the books behind you, I think maybe one might be sociology. Maybe what are the ones that are behind you?
Well, these are actually, I'd like to think I have the world's best collection of environmental sociology books. So there's about two shelves there
Oh, wow.
of just environmental solution, but it works up. What do I have? A lot of interdisciplinary books. Somewhere up there, I got old classics from George Perkins, Marsh. That I was for a long time very interested in the history of environmentalism. Um, but then, oops, over here, it just goes and goes. I have a lot of, you know, social movements books, environmental policy books, a bunch of stuff nowadays where the political polarization in America and all the stuff on post-truth and misinformation, that's kind of the kind of things
If,
I'm
if
interested
you
in
have
nowadays.
that many, there must be variety, which is good. And when you mention also, the history of, let's say, environmental ethics, well, then that kind of gives us again more insight about how worldviews might change. And for example, you talked about climate denial. Now, for some people living in certain areas or certain lifestyles, it's kind of easy to deny, and some of us might be upset if we read articles of trusted scientists, but that's not what they read to judge things. It's how their lifestyle day to day is impacted. But again, even if you convince them, then what makes them not act different? And for me, there's a big lack of sentience and sapience in our species. So that's why I have named my vlogs or my research a lot of the time In Search of the Elusive Homo sapien. Because for me, it's like Sasquatch. I have not found one that I can be certain reflects consistently behaviors of sentience and sapience as defined a particular way. And that would include
Yeah.
people that are ahead of departments of whatever environmental
Oh,
studies.
yeah. No, I don't live a perfect lifestyle. You know, I got, there's, you want to be a successful academic, you want to fly to some conferences, you get invited to give
Don't say
talks.
fly.
No, I know, I know.
Greta might listen.
It's really, you know, this was before the really strong connection between how just horrible the footprints of flying and so forth, but creates a dilemma, you know, if you have a chance to go talk to an important audience and so forth. But I think that the one positive thing of the terrible COVID crisis is that there'll be a lot of, you know, the only talks I've given, I've been on virtual conferences,
It'll
and I
force
think that's
people
gonna,
to get more familiar with that kind of technology.
yeah, yeah,
And even though, they'd be iffy, it'll force us to develop better internet channels. It'll force us to realize also that, hey, that wasn't so bad and it seemed efficient and I had as many responses after as if I flew there. And again, we are missing a lot of social interactions right now that we can also notice we can get some. I don't think we should become too dependent on it. Schooling as well shouldn't remain too much online when things change, because I think that is a threat to us as social creatures,
exactly.
become even more dependent on what we think is making life easier, when in the long term it's actually destroying our ability to collaborate and problem solve as a species, to not have basic social skills, conflict resolution skills, um,
Yeah,
listening skills of all kinds. So these are, with phones and technology. And I'm not a big fan of believing that technology will solve things. For example, one example I gave somebody is, if we invent, a perfect straw to decontaminate water or even make salt water drink, whatever it is again, it'll be a problem of distribution. Why will there be inequality? And it's the same psychological issues we have now. So what's wrong with our thinking as a species that has never undergone its first technological revolution of developing human thinking tools, a human operating system, as a collective, as a majority everywhere?
yeah,
And that is the real pandemic for before I was born as a baby.
yeah.
So
But things are infinitely worse now, and you're kind of skipping one thing. But
tell me.
well, what I'm into, I've always been interested in conservatism, the conservative movement, etc. So with a grad student, I began tracking uh, the role of this conservative movement, and especially think tanks, in promoting climate change denial way back in the mid 90s. And for a quarter of a century, I've been following that, and it's evolved um, over time. I would say the anti-tobacco, the that effort to protect tobacco companies by dismissing the science, questioning it. We call it the tobacco playbook. It was brought in many of the same people to combat climate science and do that. And that has played a key role in leading to our so-called post-fact, alternate fact, uh, post-truth society, which Trump,
Disconnected from reality,
yeah,
in a way that now would be almost impossible to reconnect to it, because the shock would send somebody in a coma for 10 years.
yeah. Well, and let me say, and the key thing that we can't underestimate is the role of conservative media. I mean, Fox News has changed America profoundly. Just Rupert Murdoch, an immigrant from Australia, has just flipped it. And now we have these other two, Newsmax and Onan, and then we have all these websites, Breitbart and that, and of course talk radio. Rush Limbaugh initiated intense anti-environmentalism, and so this right wing is blown into an echo chamber. And a lot of people, we talk about people write stories. I lost my dad to Fox. I lost my, I have a half brother I don't talk to because he watches all this
Like a
stuff.
cult, that they
Yeah,
can't
yeah.
retrieve their loved ones from.
But it's bigger. Those are clearly the
Okay,
Trump people.
Riley, a lot of what I talk in my research, and I just wrote you an email that had this term today, because I don't want to vilify the obvious villains. What I need to do, especially working on my grand unification theory in the social sciences, is to vilify the norm, the 9 out of 10 nice people in society. Because when you go and eventually, let's say have an intervention and somebody understands how they've been wrong about something, let's say from Fox News, what makes them flawed, even if, they never had TV, they could still be convinced with one conversation with a neighbor that they can believe something and not deviate from it. So that's a flaw in the norm because it is incredibly common, and you tell them right and wrong as if, okay, you love your kids, then don't you realize you have to maybe change things? Oh, I love my children, don't you? And then they'll attack you when you take care of their kids more than they do. So there's a flaw with the norm. So, I mean, we can't just label villains when the nice people in society are actually more of the guiding force historically, and they allow this. So I talk about things like intellectual laziness. I talk about religion and also the monetary paradigm separating us from reality. I talk about, human chauvinism has been promoted by every type of worldview, every religion as well. And these are deadly to our species and the rest of the planet. But what also makes people, like in Canada, when we have a government that says we've declared an emergency, this is an emergency, and yet they act no differently, and yet maybe they have agendas. But why are Canadians so dumb as a majority that they don't challenge this? Wait, you said you want us to take your government seriously? You just declared it an emergency, and then you're back to business as usual. Yeah. So what is flawed with the norm? So what do you think? I mean, when you kind of know how we got better at brainwashing ourselves and our kids, even though that leads to an evolutionary dead end, how do you explain that?
Well, I'm there's so much written, psychology and climate change and how beliefs don't transfer to behavior. I can't even imagine thousands of journal articles. I've only read some. And
Yeah, but I'm asking your opinion whether you read the right article or not. For example, I am not afraid. If you looked at the main song that I pops up on my YouTube, I'm not afraid to say we are a failed species.
yeah, I
So,
think I would say right now our problem the U.S. is becoming a failed state. So I know deep down, but you're talking about deep, long range things. Right now, I'm focused on the Green New Deal. Can Biden really do something? Can we take leadership in the world and really finally begin to significantly cut carbon emissions? If we don't do that, all the talk about evolution, where we're going, we're never going to play out long enough for these things. And so I don't want to sound like I'm dismissive of these deeper, longer run things, but right now, I'm more interested in opposing this anti-scientific view that is becoming part of like the worldview of 30 to 40% of the North American and probably Canadian public, where it's coming from, because that's what's blocking us now. And we're not going to be 400 years from now if we don't do things in climate
well,
change.
I
So
understand that what you're focusing on now is actually an important step for
yeah,
this change in the
but
future.
let me add, just to me, this kind of right wing, anti scientific, uh, it's human exemptionalism on steroids. I mean, what it started with Reagan, but it's come back. No, we can grow forever. Progress is good. You just let us have free markets and cut taxes, and we're going to grow and we're all going to prosper. And
Oh,
it's
uh,
people
pe-
pushing that
people
who are
believe we're
making,
all going to prosper. How do they believe that? That it's everybody will be equally
yeah.
prosperous for an unlimited amount of time? Because that you
I
need
I
to
have
have some serious mental illness to believe this. and to not be
Yeah.
discredited when you say it on Fox News. So what's happening?
Well, I mean, have you ever listened to people, not only Trump, like Jim Jordan and a lot of these other Republicans?
Not a lot,
You know,
Riley, but let me tell you something I haven't said online yet. Is I have a list of countries where I might go to, but I would feel very insecure, like I'm in a terrorist state. One of them is China. And on May, I don't know if it was May 3rd or May 8th, it was a Sunday. The United States got on that list, right? As a
Yeah.
collective,
Yeah.
it is so untrustworthy and would make me feel on alert all the time that it made that list.
Yeah.
Now,
I
it
can
made that
understand
list when the cup overfilled, when the lady that was the spokesperson for Trump, with the cross, she's religious, I guess, she said something so utterly ridiculous that the cup that was almost full just and you can't come back from that. Biden might make the perfect moves his entire, and you can't come back from that. Like in my lifetime, I don't know that the United States, as a redneck collective, meaning people that are not guilty of their own ignorance, will win me feeling safe going there. I might, but I'd have to get a lot of support to feel safe going there.
Well, I can relate to that. I happen now to have an Asian wife and stepson, and it's created lots of stress for us. But here's what I want to say, because I don't want, with these folks who are so totally unscientific. I mean, the ideology is so strong that if science gets in the way, like on COVID, you just dismiss it. You cannot have people making progress to an ecological worldview, to appreciating the situation we're in, when they don't even believe that COVID is dangerous, or the vaccine. So what I'm working on now is a more immediate situation, because I'm not even thinking of the future of Homo sapiens in hundreds and hundreds of years. I'm thinking of things like, will American democracy survive the next election? Will American scientists be free to continue their work, or will we see what was going on under Trump and so forth? But it all stems for me from an understanding of human exemptionalism and how horrible it is, and it's kind of a natural mate for right-wing extremism. And
Riley, can you explain to our viewers that term? Because for me, I would have used just anthropocentrism, because for me, it's automatically a negative term, or human chauvinism, which I'd have to define, that's automatically a negative term. So, the three letters, right? It's HEP.
yeah,
So please define this, because it is not commonly used as a term, maybe mostly in psychology.
yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of, if I may, from an article, it's a little, but um, it involves assumptions about us as a species. So when we wrote this in a formal list, and any list is inadequate you can't begin to convey a worldview with four assumptions, but people are fundamentally different from all other creatures on Earth over which we have dominion. Assumptions about what causes social change. People are masters of their destiny. They can choose their goals and learn to do whatever is necessary to achieve them. Kind of the context of human society. The world is vast and thus provides unlimited opportunities for humans. And about constraints, the history of humanity is one of progress. For every problem, there is a solution, and thus progress never ceases. It's that view that we are so special with our science, our technology, our creativity, our minds. what goes on in the environment has no effect. It's
So
just,
there's human chauvinism in that. But the
yeah,
terms you actually use this time, not the ones I was reading from 1978, is it sounded almost like humanism. It sounded like the potential of what we can do and to solve our own problems.
yeah.
But if you look at the article from 1978, I think started page 42 and 43, are you talking about those four terms that seem more disconnected from reality, you know, if they are part of the collective worldviews? And for me, it's again, it suggests we believe we're the center of the universe, you
Yeah.
know, and most definitely some part of the divine role compared to, let's say, ants or salmon or things. But if we got rid of ants or bees or salmon, tell you what, the science of sociology wouldn't exist for a very long time after that, right? So what causes us to think this? Now, of course, I can explain this through a lot of religious paradigms that amazes me. Like sometimes I criticize China by saying, wow, you claim to be a 5,000-year-old civilization, yet no country on earth has ever stabilized a proto-civilization. Then how come, you know, you haven't done more in that time? And just since, you know, the press came out, or you know, we have all these different scientific disciplines. What causes us to not take more steps forward with it? And again, it's how we interact with each other. It's how we see status, and also what we see today. There's a big link. I don't know if you know it, but when you talked about this current pandemic and what causes people to act cautiously for the protection of others or not is the same thing with the ones that were making money in tobacco or oil industry, because it's how much you can almost evaluate somebody's sentience or able to reference the outside world, including their own children, their own offspring, and make changes. Now that's a flaw that's been hundreds, well, let's say thousands of years, is not something we have solved. It just looks different today. And the COVID pandemic today, when I write about it, I say that this is a very light reaction the natural world interconnections we belong to is giving us. It's almost like a palliative care it's given us, because it's like giving us time, one last chance to kind of change our ways. It's super light. And the reason for us it's big, it's because our social structures, including the medical and you know, trade within our nations or with others, because we've been playing this monopoly game. We're not able to solve a lot of our own issues as nations, is they're built on a fragile house of cards to push the elites up and bring equality. And it's really a social and thinking pandemic. And I write as well that viruses and bacteria evolve so much quicker that not just mammals like us, but even quicker than our flawed, built on house of cards social structures. And that's the conversations we must have. And I also criticize CBC in Canada, for example, for having specialists where they sound like they're at a barbecue together in the backyard. They're not talking about the real things that are important, and they're talking in a way that they're trying to increase their elite status. They're not trying to educate the public, and they're not trying to give us the solutions that will make them unpopular. And for me, I call a scientist a compromised scientist unless they say what they're supposed to say, even if they become unpopular. So for me, I don't know any uncompromised scientists, because they're too politically correct.
Oh, certainly, like Fauci's trying, but they work under extreme constraints. But I just, it hit me two things. We've been talking for at least an hour, I think, or close to it. And while we're finding it very interesting, I'm a little bit, it's a long time for someone to watch. And second, and more immediate to me, is I promised my wife and son we'd go for a walk before it got dark. And we're 2 hours ahead. So,
Okay, I will finish in 5 minutes.
okay.
But before I finish, do you have any follow-ups?
Yeah, I wanted, you stimulated one thing just to come forward. nowadays when I try to talk about, when I talk about the shift from a kind of a human exemptionalist or anthropocentric view to an ego, I say, there have been about there have been a number of major intellectual revolutions. But first, we had the Copernican revolution. It taught us that, whoa, the universe does not revolve around the earth, right? That our planet is not quite there. We had the Darwinian revolution that says, hey, we're not so, we evolved from other species, it's not, we're totally distinct. In some ways, we had the Freudian revolution that, despite all the issues about Freud, that, we're not the real totally rational creatures. Each of those has sort of helped decenter people. It's helped reduce what you would call human chauvinism. And I see the sort of ecological revolution is in that same vein. So those are those big steps. But anyway, yeah, I think we should
I know
sign
what
off.
you mean, that those things have caused progress and steps forward. But studying the human condition from the outside perspective, which is a very painful thing to do and a very lonely life, I see that we're still falling behind on modernity, mostly caused by technology used irresponsibly since almost the beginning of fire, almost. And that is because collective learning, the concept of collective learning, which is at the root of our species evolving in the way that it did, has not evolved proportionately with modernity. So for me, I'm working on those things. Let me
Okay.
give you another scale. I think Canada is a country that doesn't mobilize or make decisions or do anything. The opposite, maybe China mobilizes and acts, but rarely on the right solutions. And right now, the USA, I am also like you, saying, oh, it looks like Biden is working on some good things. But of course, he's working within a system that is very challenging, right? So, but again, so the USA right now can be an example to Canada that does nothing and China that does more, but often on the wrong solution. So I'm curious about following that as well. So
Okay.
thank you for your time. And yes, family promise. And send me a picture of you and your Asian wife and stepson. And I think you said you had a daughter. And I'll send you pictures of me when I was in Vietnam, South Korea, Japan. And I think you're surprised with how much fun and how relaxed this conversation was. And I hope that you'll send me an email, Martin. I would like to have another one. And the last thing is, Riley, I do not give a damn if nobody watches our video. That is not at all important to me, the length. What's important is that we feel good about it. It ends with a nice closure, that it's still open, and it went the way it went, that we're both happy. If people don't want to watch it, for me, it's a sign that it doesn't make a difference. And I often talk about, I could make a perfect YouTube video, the shortest possible way to send the message, the most efficient way. But if you're talking about something people don't want to shift with, why make that effort? So for me, this was a success. Go ahead.
Yeah. I'm still under a lot of time pressure, things. Now, I know that if I write an article, a lot of people will see it. So when I feel, if I seem stingy with my time, I mean, I'm living in that kind of world. Okay. So,
You were totally respectful in saying what your priorities and your time are, and I have no problem with that.
okay.
Last request from you that should be very easy is I'm gonna post this May 1st, right? This video. And I want you before May 1st to just send me a couple of links that talks about you or some of the subjects that we talked about that I'll add to my notes with the video. So what are the favorite places online that talks about what you've done or you or the subjects that you've promoted? So I'll use those links of yours. Like,
Okay.
for example, you sent me articles, but they're a file. So if there's anything that's a link, that I could add to the notes with my YouTube video.
Okay, I'll do that. I mean, we're gonna have a very short walk now. So, okay, nice talking to you.
Thank you for your time. I'm sorry I was late. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Gotta go.